Hi, our final project was of the KX125 dirt bike, and my name is Sam Buchanan.
I'm Stephen Rose.
I'm Jonathan Seiler.
I'm Jay Prakash.
This is a assembly drawing. It has about 8 sub-assemblies. It We did not have the actual dimensions, so it was all guesswork.
All right, so here's the explode assembly drawing. Like I said, there are 8 sub-assemblies, so that's how we split up in this explode view. We did not split up into all 100 plus parts because you wouldn't be able to see everything. So first thing you have is the engine, two engine assemblies in the middle, and then you have the front end and the back end with the 2 wheels respectively. And we have a couple of random parts that didn't end up in sub-assemblies because it just didn't really fit in those sub-assemblies. So that's kind of how we split it all up, and now we're going to go through everybody's parts individually and tell you kind of how everything was built and how we put it all together.
So this is one of the first sub-assemblies. It is of the front end. It includes my wheel assembly and Sam's front fork assembly.
This is the front fork assembly. It is consistent of 11 different parts, including the axle bracket and the list shown on the drawing right there. This is the interior of it and how it kind of all aligns. As you can see, there's several cylinders going inside of each other, and there's a push rod that goes through the very, very middle that connects to the spring guide, which guides the spring all the way around the top part. And the bottom is connected to the portion that you saw beforehand on the full front end assembly. These are all the individual parts that go into that fork assembly, and as you can see, dimension 2 of them, they're not very complicated parts, but each individually were referenced with respect to one another as far as dimensions were concerned. This is the rear suspension assembly. As you can see, it connects to the wheel via the swing arm at the very back. It's consistent of 8 parts. This is kind of how it all aligns. There's a few pins that go into different holes and connect all of it together. There's a rocker arm that rocks back and forth, which actually creates the suspension aspect of it, as well as the spring going through the rod and the spring guide at the very bottom to guide the spring up into the shock absorber. And as mentioned, the swing arm connects to the rest of the assembly. These are all the individual parts for that assembly and how they all were individually drawn. Then again, not too complicated, but they were all based off of each other because they all had to do with the individual portions.
All right, so this is the fuel system assembly. It has 9 major parts in it. They're listed on the right there. A couple of the big ones. Right in the middle, there's the carburetor. It has the cap on top for a fuel line. There's the choke valve sitting off kind of the middle left there. And then the bottom has a fuel float tank with a fuel float inside of it. All right, so these are the 9 individual parts for the fuel system. Most of them weren't that complicated. Finding dimensions was a little funky. We had to kind of play with that to make them all fit in the end. But the parts themselves were not terribly complicated, except for the carburetor itself. That one took a while, and I'll talk more in depth on that later. But you have the carburetor, obviously. The bottom right and the bottom left, respectively, are the fuel tank, the fuel float tank, and the fuel float itself. And then the bottom left, the bottom middle left, rather, that part is how it connects to the rest of the engine. And then you have the choke valve on the top right. All right, so this is the carburetor. This was the more complicated part from this assembly. Most of it was just done in part design, but small parts of it were done in GSD just to simplify kind of how the design was done. It was based very heavily off of other parts that we had already made. This was one of the last things I designed. Yeah. All right, so this is the top end assembly, my second one. This one was more complicated than the fuel system assembly. You can see in the picture there's the cylinder in the middle there. That's the main part. On top of that is a cylinder head. That's how it connects to the rest of the engine. Then there's the spark plug sticking out the top. Kind of in the back left, there's an attachment for a hose that connects to the expansion chamber and the muffler. We have a couple of exhaust valves in there, and then we have the main shaft sticking out for power for the rest of the engine. These are all of the first 10 parts for the top end. Again, most of them weren't terrible. You have the spark plug, the engine bracket. That's how it connects to the frame, actually. Then you see the cylinder head and the cylinder itself. Those were quite complicated. That took quite a while to design. They were based heavily off of each other. Wasn't a whole lot to do with the rest of it, but they were very heavily based off each other. And then we have a couple of exhaust valves and some other bits and pieces. And we'll go on to the next slide. And these are the last 5 parts for the top end. The 3 on the left were not terribly complicated to design, but the 2 on the right were very heavily GSD. The first one there is the expansion chamber. That connects from the cylinder to the muffler. That was one continuous multi-section surface. That took a lot of playing around with the full assembly to get the dimensions right. And then the last one there is the muffler, which connects the expansion chamber and muffles the sound of the engine, obviously. All right, so this was the first part that I had troubles with. This is the cylinder head. It goes on top of the cylinder. The only dimension I really knew of this was the diameter of the cylinder itself. Everything else was kind of eyeballed until it looks right. But most of it was able to be made in part design. A little bit of the little protrusion on the left there, that was made in GSD just to make things easy on myself. And the last part that I wanted to talk about was the muffler. This one turned out really well in my opinion. I modeled everything about this in GSD basically. Just blended it, the middle pipe from end to end, and then added the outer shell around it to muffle the sound.
So this is the wheel assembly, and I made this. It came out to about 5 parts, and I will show you those 5 parts in later slides. So these are the main parts that go into the wheel assembly. As you can see on the left, there is the spokes that were made in GSD. On the bottom left, that is the brake disc that was made in assembly design, and you can see in the center there the brake hub that holds all of the spokes, the tire, and the rim. And the hardest part about this was getting all of these spokes to line up with the brake hub and the rim to have the parts on the top right there, the spoke screws, to be able to fasten all of those spokes in place. And in the bottom right there, you can see the front axle. And these are all the other parts that I had for other things in the assembly. So on the top left is a brake caliper, and below that you can see the brake pad. As you can see on the bottom left, that is the brake reservoir and the bracket that connects it to the brake lever and the handlebar. And to the right of that, you can see the other part of the fastener. And above that, that is for the clutch lever, and that is the part that holds the clutch lever to the handlebars. And above that is the caliper piston. And these are the rest of my parts. On the left side, you can see the front fork brackets, and they hold Sam's front fork in line with the frame to the wheel. And below that, you can see the front fork steering axle. In the middle there, you can see the handlebars, which I made in GSD. And then on the right there, you can see 2 other parts that go into Jay's assembly, which is the clutch cover and the clutch housing. And on the bottom there, you can see the pivot shaft.
So this is an engine subassembly. It has over 22 parts, but I chose to mention only 16 important parts. I did not make this engine assembly all in one. I made 3 subassemblies, one of the crankshaft and one of the right side of the engine and the left side of the engines respectively. I combined them all together. So this is my left crankcase, and it was the most complicated part. It included a lot of GSD. The crankcase has an attachment to the top end of the cylinder through a plane and a piston valve. This is my crank rod. I used multi-section solids to do this. So these are some of my parts. So the third part is the ratchet gear, which allows movement only in one direction. Fourth one is the magnetostator, and the fifth one is the engine cover, which covers the magneto subassembly and the engine sprocket. And the last 2 are the shafts, kick shaft and the output shaft. And here the first one is the gear shift pedal. The second one is the magneto core with the coil wound on it, and the last one is the kicker, which was designed in GSD.
So in conclusion, this is our final project. We think that it went well given that we had no dimensions to go off of. We just had a service manual with part pictures, and we think that it came out as best as it could, and we thank you for watching.